Hey everybody, welcome to the briefing room. I'm Devin Dwyer with our political reporter Johnny Verhoeven. Hope you're staying warm on this icy and snowy Wednesday across town. The government here in Washington is shut down today. It's very quiet with the storm, but there's a lot of action happening in politics today at the Supreme Court, which was in session today. We'll get to all of that coming up, but do want to start with a story you may not have been paying attention to. If you were following closely the 2018 midterm elections, believe it or not, there's still one congressional race that is yet to be decided. It's down in North Carolina. It's the 9th congressional district there. Johnny Verhoeven has been following this closely. This is all about a controversy over voter fraud, allegations of voter fraud, Johnny. And in fact, today, past few days, the State Board of Elections in North Carolina has been holding hearings, evidentiary hearings, to try to decide whether or not they need to do a do-over in that congressional race. What's the latest right now?
Well, so this hearing's been going on since Monday. And basically what investigators have been doing have been laying out this entire alleged election fraud scheme, which has, thrown the entire election into doubt. They may have to call a new election. Been hearing from witnesses, and prosecutors have kind of been laying out what exactly went wrong in this race, and it's just a crazy story that keeps getting crazy.
Yeah, it was a very close race between Mark Harris, the Republican, Dan McCready, the Democrat, a Republican seat. The Republican did win in this case by 905 votes. But as you've been following, this is not without any controversy. There's Mark Harris. You see a picture. In fact, let's bring in ABC affiliate reporter Jonah Kaplan, who's the political reporter down there in North Carolina with WTVD, who's been following the case there on the ground. Jonah, you've been tracking the hearing today. For those of us who haven't, and our viewers who haven't been watching this as closely, bring us up to speed on the latest, and what do you think the chances are they actually hold another election in that district?
Well, it's so important to remember this affects more than 700,000 people living in North Carolina. I mean, we're 3 months away, removed from Election Day. We are 6 weeks into 2019. We're 2 weeks past the State of the Union address, and 700,000 people don't have a congressman. Right now, the State Board of Elections really has to decide, one, was there fraud that went on over the course of the campaign? Two, did that fraud, if it happened, have a significant impact that it tainted the results of the election? Was there enough fraud that if it wasn't there, well, would the outcome still have been the same? That's what they have to weigh right now. And every day we're learning a little bit more, just incredible revealing testimonies. The first day we heard from some of these workers who were on the ground in Bladen County, which is a rural southern county in North Carolina. She testified that she was illegally signing as a witness on absentee ballots, illegally collecting them and mailing them in. Yesterday, we heard from the founder of the consulting firm, political consulting firm, who hired the man, McCrae Dowless, who's accused of running this scheme. And investigators here in the North Carolina State Board of Elections, they've been very clear. They say their evidence points to a coordinated, unlawful, and substantially resourced scheme to illegally collect absentee ballots. Right now, literally just walked out of the courtroom. The big witness today is Mark Harris's son, John. And guys, I mean, just again, new things every day.
Yeah, it's incredible. We want to come back to this issue with John, Jonah. It's some really fascinating stuff today. But Johnny, I want to ask you whether you think that what is this board actually investigating?
Right.
Is this a criminal investigation?
Right.
Could people potentially go to jail based on some of the evidence that Jonah was talking about that they now say they have, that there was election fraud here?
Right. Well, definitely the man at the center of this whole scandal that was allegedly running this scheme, his name is McCrae Dowless, this political operative. He is definitely at risk of going to jail because in North Carolina, I'm sure, as Jonah knows, and Jonah and I have been going back and forth on Twitter all day about this because this has been a truly a pretty interesting day. But handling ballots and collecting absentee ballots and turning them in is a felony in North Carolina. You can go to prison about that. Now, that's a separate issue from whether or not a new election would actually be called. But today, and over the last couple of days, like Jonah's been saying, we have been learning about the broad nature of this scheme, and it really was big.
And Jonah, as they gather this evidence, they hear the testimony, and as you said, the State Board of Elections official, the executive director, basically outright said there was a coordinated scheme here. What sort of factors are they weighing when deciding to have a new election? What will tip the scale to make this actually happen?
Well, they have to accept really one of two narratives. The one from supporters of the Democrat, Dan McCready, is if there was any fraud, which there seems to be, then it invalidates the whole race. It doesn't matter what the margin of victory was. Any fraud means it's an invalid election. We have to do it over. Republicans and supporters of Mark Harris, they say, look, we understand and acknowledge that there was something nefarious going on. It shouldn't have happened. People should be punished for it. But the margin of victory, 905 votes, there hasn't been any evidence yet to suggest that there were more than 905 votes that were either withheld, tampered with, or changed in any way. In fact, they say that the voter intent had always been there, nothing changed. We're just talking about how these ballots were illegally collected. So the board really has to, again, decide, was there fraud, and was it enough to taint the election? If 4 out of 5 of these members, and it's a 5-member bipartisan board, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, because the governor in North Carolina is a Democrat. So if 4 out of 5 of them agree that there was too much fraud, that it taints the entire outcome of the race, they will call for a new election.
And of course, Johnny, this also complicates the Republican Mark Harris's standing among North Carolina voters, particularly in light of the testimony we heard today that Jonah was talking about. His son has testified this morning. Mark Harris's own son went on the record and said, you know, I actually told my dad that there were some suspect practices going on in the race.
Which runs completely counter to a comment that Mark Harris made last year where he said no one raised red flags to me about McCrae Dowless. But now you have his son, and I believe he's still testifying now, saying, look, you know, I looked at some numbers from a 2016 race. I saw that there were some abnormalities in this rural in Bladen County. And I brought those concerns to my parents, to my father, and said, look, you know, I think there may be something weird going on here. You should definitely investigate this. But then at the end of the day, he said, this was my father's decision, and he made the decision to hire.
Going to be an awkward Thanksgiving dinner this year for sure, and a fascinating race. The only race from the 2018 midterm election still outstanding. Go follow Jonah Kaplan on Twitter if you don't already. Our WFTV friend and reporter down in North Carolina. Thank you, Jonah, for your reporting. We'll be back with you, I'm sure, later this week, and appreciate your analysis, Johnny, as well on that. Thank you so much. Meantime, some big news coming out of the Supreme Court, shifting gears a little bit today. The Supreme Court ruled in a unanimous opinion today on a case out of Indiana that the 8th Amendment's protection against excessive fines applies nationwide. Believe it or not, they hadn't incorporated that right from the Bill of Rights to all the states. They did so today in the case of this man, Tyson Timbs, of Indiana. I think we have a picture of Tyson, 37-year-old former opioid addict. He was convicted a few years back. Here you see Tyson on the right with his attorney, Wesley Hoddett, who argued the case. Tyson Timbs was tried, convicted of a small drug offense, and the state of Indiana seized his $42,000 Land Rover. Well, Tyson Timbs said that was an excessive punishment to take his car, and today he won before the Supreme Court. And we're joined now by Tyson's attorney, Wesley Hoddett, who joins us from Seattle via Skype. Sir, great to see you, and was there on the day you argued this case, so congratulations. Give us your reaction to the court's decision today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's very gracious of you to congratulate us. The court today unanimously held that the federal constitutional protection against excessive fines must be applied by state and local authorities. And what that means is that state trial judges now have the power, indeed the duty, to ensure a nationwide standard of excessiveness where police and prosecutors, although they have the power to take people's property, there are limits, and judges have been directed to enforce those limits.
This is, it's sort of striking because this is such big business across the country. The organization that you are a part of, an Institute for Justice, actually crunched some of the numbers. We have them, we can put them up here. From just a few years ago, that 26 states, including the District of Columbia, seized basically in funds and property more than $254 million. Just in that year alone. This is a huge business. And in this case, Wesley, the state of Indiana seized Tyson Timbs' Land Rover, $42,000, because they said that it was actually a weapon used in a crime, a tool used in a crime, and that they were taking it off the streets. They weren't taking it out on him. They were simply removing a tool. But you argued successfully to the contrary, that this was actually part of his personal property.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, the facts here were that Tyson, who lives in rural Grant County, Indiana, drove at the urging of a confidential informant, drove to meet with some undercover officers and sold them a small amount of heroin. It was worth less than $400 in total. And because of that really incidental event that he drove there, and I think any of us living in a rural county might choose to drive rather than take non-existent transit or try to walk many miles, the government in Indiana decided that they could take his $42,000 vehicle as a kind of secondary punishment. And here, 5 years later, Tyson is still fighting back against that after doing everything that was asked of him. He pleaded guilty, he served his time, he paid the fees that were imposed on him, he's gotten clean, he's holding down a job, and yet still the government is kicking him while he's down and making all of those things harder. This is the dirty secret of the American criminal justice system, that civil forfeiture allows the government to strip people of their property if they've committed crimes. Indeed, it allows the government to strip people of property even without convicting them of a crime.
Yeah,
about
that's
80%.
And just to interrupt you there, that's the striking thing that many of our viewers might not know, that in a lot of these cases of civil asset forfeiture, the government can simply take your property without a hearing, without extensive due process. Here's what Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wrote today in the opinion of the court, her first opinion since that cancer surgery back in December. She said the protection against excessive fines guards against abuses of government's punitive or criminal law enforcement authority. The safeguard we hold is fundamental to our scheme of ordered liberty with deep roots in our history and tradition. And Wesley, before we let you go, what's the next step here for states? You were talking about how this has gone on unchecked for years in many places. What will states now have to do? What steps will they have to implement in the wake of this decision?
Well, there's a practical impact and there's a more nuanced impact on the law. And the practical impact is that Indiana and the 3 other states that currently reject the excessive fines protection will have to start enforcing it. But the more nuanced impact, the long-term impact that we hope to litigate one day in front of the Supreme Court, is what is an excessive fine or forfeiture? And I think that the Supreme Court today announced unanimously that it cares about that question and it's going to police civil forfeiture in the future. We look forward to bringing the cases that test exactly where that line is.
Yeah, they didn't set that line in this case. They didn't put that language in the opinion, as you said, very broad. Thanks so much, Wesley Hottet. I do have to ask you before we let you go, is Tyson Timbs going to get that Land Rover back?
We'll see. It depends on what the state of Indiana wants to do. Do they want to fight for this truck, or do they want to just give it back to Tyson? And it depends on what the Indiana Supreme Court wants to do in light of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling. Whatever it takes, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder with Tyson to make sure he gets his truck back.
All right, Wesley Hottet joining us via Skype from Seattle, the counsel of Tyson Timbs, the Indiana man who won today before the Supreme Court, setting in a unanimous opinion a new rule nationwide, putting in place a check against state power to seize private property. Our thanks to him for joining us. Moving on now to the continuing fallout over the emergency declaration that President Trump issued just a week or so ago, declaring an emergency at the border and invoking his power to seize federal government funds to build that southern border wall. Well, as you've heard, 16 states are now suing the administration. So are a number of landowners in southern Texas who live along the border who say their rights will be infringed upon when this border wall is constructed. And we're joined now live from South Texas by one of those landowners, Yvette Gaitan, who is one of 3 party to a separate lawsuit against President Trump. Her house actually overlooks the Rio Grande River, which is right there on the border with Mexico. Yvette, thank you so much for joining us today, and would love to get your take why you're joining this lawsuit.
Because I don't believe it's an emergency. It isn't an emergency. Actually, I live here every day. I'm here day in, day out, and I'm not scared to be out here. There's no real emergency. Yes, there is illegals crossings. I personally haven't seen any on my property. I see it on the news. I'm sure there is plenty going on, but not The wall doesn't need to go from one point of the border to the other point of the border. He needs to do other things to secure our border.
Now, we're seeing some pictures here of your house, which is right on the border, and obviously we can see behind you the river there. That's the Rio Grande. So on the other side of the river, that's Mexico? Point out just a couple things if you can. Point out where you are and what we're seeing.
Well, right now I'm about probably like 60 feet away from actually the riverbank, and you can see the river right here. There's some fields across in Mexico. I don't know if you can have my Rizo Spring, but there's fields right there, and you can constantly hear the tractors plowing them, and you see people out there working them. But other than that, that's all there is right now.
And where would the wall be built? In the lawsuit, you said that the government actually already contacted you last year, asking for permission to come onto your property and prepare to begin construction. Where behind you would they be building this wall?
It wouldn't be behind me. Actually, it would be right in front of me, which is that way.
Wow.
Which is towards the house.
So it would still be on your property, sort of dividing your property then, which your property runs up to the river, does it?
Yes, it does. But from what I'm hearing from other places, they're taking a mile. My house does not sit a mile from the river. It doesn't even sit half a mile away. It sits 435 feet away from the river.
Wow.
So.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about what the president has. What the president has been saying, Yvette. He obviously has called this an emergency. The administration has argued that for the greater good, that a wall is necessary for national security reasons where you're standing. What do you say to that argument that a little inconvenience to you, maybe some construction over a little while, is for the greater good of the country to keep us safe? Is that something that holds water with you?
No, because if that was true, then he would be trying to change policy. He would be trying to work to give incentives to people to actually join the Border Patrol in securing our borders. He cut their budget. When was it? Last year that they got budget cuts? So how is it an emergency if you're cutting budgets to a department that secures your border?
Yeah, and just as a message to him and to lawmakers before we let you go, if this does in fact go through and they're successful in starting construction on your property, what will that mean to you? What will you do? Will you have to move?
It depends on how much land they actually want. Like I said, my home actually sits 435 feet away, so it just depends on what they want, how much property of it they want, and it would mean everything because my dad built this house with his two bare hands being blind, and he worked hard for that house. And the land has been in our family for generations.
So certainly a passionate and very personal fight for you and your family, one of 3 landowners that are now suing the Trump administration in federal court over the land rights that are part of this border wall story. Yvette Gaitan, thank you so much for joining us. Really important to have your perspective and fantastic to be able to see firsthand where that border wall will go. So thank you for joining us. We'll continue to follow that story. Finally today, back to some 2020 politics. And Johnny Vrhovic is still here with us. Johnny, we come out of the holiday weekend with some absolutely incredible fundraising numbers for Bernie Sanders, who just got in the race early this week. Give us the latest on what his campaign is saying for how much money they've raised.
It is pretty astounding. In the first 24 hours since he announced yesterday at around 7 a.m., Bernie Sanders has raised $6 million.
Wow. Which,
to put it in perspective, the next closest 2020 Democrat this cycle was Kamala Harris. She raised $1.5 million in the first 24 hours. Amy Klobuchar raised just over $1 million in the first 48 hours. I mean, this truly is evidence that Bernie Sanders is going to be a formidable candidate this time around, even for those that have, concerns that he still needs to win back some Democrats after 2016.
That's incredible, and you can see some of the comparisons here on the screen. I mean, he's in a league of his own when it comes to fundraising, and he was back in 2012 as well, but this just shows that that support has certainly been sustained. And how important is money this early? I mean, we're pretty far out from the election.
We're very far out. We're just under a year away from the Iowa caucuses, from the first nominating process. But money is a very, it's a very important indicator, A, of how much resources you're going to have going forward, and B, just how much grassroots support you're going to have. So the 6 million number is very important for Bernie, but that was from over 150,000 individual donors, which just goes to the point that this very active base that he has, it looks like they're going to be just as active this time around.
Wow, I'm going to force a lot of the other candidates to spend money as well.
Exactly.
And put them in a bind, which would be fascinating to watch. And we should say that the President of the United States is also fundraising himself off of Bernie Sanders' $6 million figure. He just put out a fundraising request warning his supporters of the fundraising prowess of Bernie Sanders. So to be continued. Johnny Vrhovic, thanks for sticking around. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us today on this snowy Wednesday. Great to see Johnny in the winter sweater as well.
Keep warm, Devin. Okay.
Here in the briefing room. We will be back tomorrow. In fact, I'm forgetting. I'm being reminded by the control room that we have a beauty shot of some of today's festivities here in Washington, and we will leave you with this, with some sledding up on Capitol Hill. Looked like a good time. Need to get out there a little bit later before the rain comes down. That's it for today on the briefing room. We will see you next time.